This is my favorite piece of environmental storytelling in all of Elden Ring. It's not the giant corrupted corpse of a fallen demigod below the capital, not the plethora of massive ruins older than the land itself, although I do love those. This specific nation butterfly, in this specific location, tops it all to me. And not just because it's a sign of MIQUELLA'S influence at the very first moment of the game. Granted, you either defeated the Grafted Scion, which, let's be honest, you didn't, or came back here after the fact. This is the all-time best to me because of where it is, what else is here, and the fact that, crucially, it is just out of reach. I would argue that this concept may be the single most important thing to understand if we are to make sense of Miquella and the events that unfolded across his journey. From the Erdtree capital where he was born, to the remote and withering Halig tree watered with his own blood, to the wailing dunes of Caelid and the underground of Nokron. I'll explain how that's involved at another time. And, at last, the Gate of Divinity, sealed behind a thick fog of shadow. I think not only was all of it fated to happen in exactly the way that it did, but held within Miquella is a fascinating divine paradox, an affliction which, upon his ascension, he was not actually freed from, but rather succumbed to. So, if we are to understand how Miquella's affliction plays into his story, we need to start by understanding what his affliction even is. Because I think it's a great deal more than just eternal youth. I would argue that that is just a symptom, and that the truth goes much deeper. As an aside, if you don't have time to watch this whole video, I recommend you skip to part 4, the final section. If there's any one takeaway I want you to have from this, you'll find everything culminating there. I think Miquella's Nations is one of several themes that evokes not just youth, but this idea of being just on the precipice, newly budding and almost bloomed. Floral imagery is very useful here, as flowers are bountiful and precious, but also fragile and short-lived. This budding imagery is all over Miquella's story, such as with the sacramental bud item, which was no doubt cultivated by him and watered with his own blood. It's described as an immature bud containing fresh blood, believed to originate long ago from a strain of buds cultivated with youthful sacramental blood. This description is clearly meant to be evocative of Miquella, with references to themes of youth, newness, incompleteness, and a unique sacramental blood. There's also the Empyrean blood burgeon, which is described as a young shoot heavy with Empyrean blood, said to burgeon forth from where the golden blood of Miquella, the wounded Empyrean, pooled. And of course, these are not the only examples of plants being grown with the blood of Miquella, as in the culminating case of his Halig tree. I think this budding imagery reflects Miquella's nature on a very deep level. His story is centralized on new beginnings, attempts at starting over anew, be it a new holy tree or a new god. There's a consistent sense of potential within Miquella's story. He wishes to remedy the sins of the past and embody compassion. He and his other self, Trina, both compel devout affections from loyal followers who seem inescapably, uncontrollably drawn to the rare, precious, and loving nature of these beings. They embody, in the simplest sense, hope and respite in a world ravaged and weary by the sins of the old order. But crucially, all of this holds a unique, tragic quality, which is that, yes, Miquella and Trina are ripe with abundance of hope and compassion. They are budding with potential, but eternally. They are buds which will, crucially, never truly blossom, only just. His eternal youth is the clearest surface-level example, but so is the eternal sapling of the Halig tree watered with Miquella's blood, which will never mature, never blossom, but only just. So is the age of compassion that ends just as it's coming into existence, only ever to be a bud and not a blossom. The entrance to the land of shadow is, after all, MIQUELLA'S cocoon, from which he will never emerge. We could even stretch this notion to how so many of MIQUELLA'S endeavors seem to have failed. He was his sister Malenia's best hope for ridding her of the scarlet rot, but was also responsible for the ravaging of Caelid by that same rot, when Malenia was sent to battle Radahn in Aeonia. We see that his works of craftsmanship, the needle, the sacrificial twig, and the spectral steed whistle exhibit a unique, profound power, and yet are also delicate and fragile. And crucially, MIQUELLA'S fate and godhood are ripe with potential, but I will argue, destined to fail from the very start. We also know MIQUELLA had some intentions regarding his brother Godwyn's body and soul, attempting to, again, remedy what happened to it in some way, deeds which were met with failure when the eclipse which was meant to give life to the soulless bones never came, which is almost certainly related to Radahn's holding back of the stars. MIQUELLA'S abundant, budding potential and his ascension to godhood is more than just Elden Ring's Messiah story. There is a fundamental paradox to MIQUELLA, and his nature, and his affliction, and his ascension. I think fundamental to MIQUELLA, and by extension his Age of Compassion, is the idea of something being only just on the precipice of blossoming into something greater before falling away. As with the nation butterflies in the Chapel of Anticipation. Just on the precipice. Just out of reach. And it's here that we can start to deepen our understanding of MIQUELLA'S affliction and fate beyond the superficial eternal youth. I really feel like this paradox is the linchpin that holds everything about MIQUELLA'S story together. So now is a good time to talk about the other end of that duality within MIQUELLA. Not budding, but wilting. And then, strangely and beautifully, both of the two at once. In the cut item description for the twin blade of Abundance and Decay, which was released in the DLC as Euphoria, it is said that MIQUELLA and his twin sister Malenia share an inseparable fate. This is cut content, but I do feel it still adequately describes what we see in-game. MIQUELLA and Malenia do reflect and contrast each other. One eternally decaying under the effects of the scarlet rot, eternally wilting, and the other eternally abundant and pure, eternally budding. Although a really important part of this video is that I don't actually think this is the case, and the truth goes deeper than that. On a surface level, it appears as if MIQUELLA and Malenia each represent opposite halves of a duality between abundance and decay. In a way, perpetual life and perpetual death, or more specifically, perpetually just coming into life and just entering death. It's something transitory. When I say that Malenia reflects a theme of just entering death, I mean that the scarlet rot, which is the core of her affliction, represents a transitory process from life to death, and then to rebirth, the process of decay. This is nothing new, and the twins' corresponding butterflies seem to confirm this. MIQUELLA'S nation butterfly appears as though it's just emerged from its cocoon for its entire life, and Malenia's Aeonian butterfly is withered by the rot. Neither fully in any final form, but in an eternal, transitory process. These are interdependent opposites. If you look up at the night sky, you can't define where a star begins without the emptiness surrounding it to tell you where it ends. A critical detail to understand here is that MIQUELLA and Malenia's shared affliction is not made manifest as MIQUELLA embodying abundance, nor Malenia decay, but rather the twins both embody the duality between abundance and decay respectively, budding and wilting. This is the core of MIQUELLA'S affliction, and I'll come to show how it is the source of everything that took place in his story. Well, after all, MIQUELLA'S own lily, symbolic of faith in his eternal sapling, Haligtree, is a flower on the verge of wilting, as is his other half Trina's lily. And I think that the decay aspect of MIQUELLA was made most manifest in the Land of Shadow and what he had to do there. I'll explain that soon. We see this imagery of simultaneous budding and wilting all over MIQUELLA'S story. Malenia's Scarlet Rot also seems to embody both abundance and decay. The decay aspect of the rot is obvious, and the abundance aspect, I think, was revealed in the Land of Shadow through Romina and the Scarlet Bud. But we'll expand more on that later in this video. The rot savaged Malenia's body just as well as it invigorated her spirit. I hope to make it clear that the twins each hold this duality within them. But what's the relevance of this, and how do we learn the way that this paradoxical, divine affliction affected both of their stories? Could this nuance hold the answer to all of our questions about MIQUELLA and how his story played out? I'm going to draw a parallel that at first might seem like it's coming out of left field. Coming into this, I want to emphasize that MIQUELLA'S life and fate culminated in the Land of Shadow and the Gate of Divinity. Everything led to this. All his discoveries, all his ambitions, all his losses brought him here, to the end of the line. Here, I think there's a fascinating and deeply poetic parallel between MIQUELLA and the Shadow Tree itself. The Shadow Tree's written lore is sparse and poetic. It doesn't need much more than it has because it tells such a vivid story with its visual design, which is one of the most striking in the game, if you ask me. The tree is many things, but what's important is that in this context, it is dual, golden sapped, and, most crucial of all, crumbling. And keeping in mind what we just said about the golden-blooded MIQUELLA, who is a dual being with reference to both himself and Saint Trina, and also with reference to the fact that he holds within him this duality of budding and wilting, let's remind ourselves what exactly MIQUELLA had to do to become a god in the Land of Shadow. He had to abandon all of himself. In pieces, gravestones, footprints, or fragments, MIQUELLA sacrificed aspects of himself at these crosses, specifically in the Land of Shadow, where a dual, golden-sapped tree is eternally crumbling. To make the parallel more obvious, eternally fragmenting. And what is at the base of every one of these crosses, other than a fragment of the holy tree itself? This is the point where MIQUELLA'S decay truly begins. The description of the Shadow Tree fragment is one of my favorites in the game for this reason. A splinter of the Shadow Tree that contains golden brilliance, acquired at the Church of Marika and other places in the Realm of Shadow. It is said that when the Shadow Tree crumbles from its core, that it will scatter across the entire Realm of Shadow. The people of the Erd Tree collect the splinters and use them in prayer. And are the fragments of MIQUELLA not scattered across the entire Realm of Shadow? I think there is a deliberate and very important parallel between the eternal fragmenting of the golden-blooded dual Shadow Tree and the fragmenting of the golden-blooded dual MIQUELLA that took place in the Land of Shadow, and was essential to his rise to godhood. So, to the question of why the fragments are at every cross aside from gameplay purposes, I think there are two possible answers. The first, less interesting one is that, as a former person of the Erd Tree, MIQUELLA somehow used the fragments in whatever this sacrificial ritual was, in a sort of prayer. But the far more interesting possibility is that somehow, in a mostly poetic way, the fragments are here as a result of the sacrificial ritual. That when MIQUELLA abandoned all aspects of himself, aspects of the holy Shadow Tree, which mirrors him all too well, were left behind. There's a lot that ties Miquella's nature to that of the Shadow Tree, aside from what we've already mentioned. He is described as the wounded Empyrean in the description for the Empyrean blood burgeon, and the spiral tree is clearly wounded, its golden blood seeping from above. Its written lore mentions wounds and abandon, which also have relevance since Miquella grievously wounded himself while abandoning fragments of his being. The two are also both tied to the idea of sacrifice, since the Shadow Tree in the Land of Shadow can be thought of as having been sacrificed by Marika and sealed away. There's also some fascinating ties between Miquella's father Radagon and the Shadow Tree. The impenetrable thorns, which seal the inside of the Erd Tree shut, are marked with Radagon's lattice rune, indicating that he was the one who sealed its entrance. And those same impenetrable thorns are a power which seems to be connected to the Shadow Tree, as per the Mantle of Thorns description. The image of the misshapen Shadow Tree is an edict. Spurn all that exists. Wound all that exists, for we have been abandoned. Radagon's body also seems to be partly composed of the same shadow which envelops the Shadow Tree. These connections may or may not be relevant to Miquella, but are interesting either way. There's another connection between the thorns and the Shadow Tree, which is that in retrospect, Melina actually seems to indirectly reference the Shadow Tree in the base game.
You were unable to enter the Erd Tree, no? Prevented by the mantle of barbs. The thorns are impenetrable, a husk of the Erd Tree's being that spurns all that exists without.
Her words are strikingly reminiscent of the Mantle of Thorns description. We can even go a layer deeper and connect the two by the spiral. Miquella has frequently been related to the spiral, in his golden braids, his fine craftsmanship, and his sigil, which is all no doubt in connection to how he would come to have his fate closely tied to the spiral of the Crucible. In the land of the Crucible, overlooked by the spiral tree of the Crucible. On another note, do you remember when all that we knew about the Land of Shadow was this single image of Miquella gazing out onto the Shadow Tree? Well, one of the first theories that came up in the community about the tree related to how closely it resembled the Halig tree. And I think, given what we've just talked about, this holds some credence. The Halig tree does, in fact, resemble a sort of incomplete spiral. It appears as though it was meant to be dual-trunked and maybe even spiralic, but of course was fated only to bud, never to blossom. The Halig tree features some similar splintering to the Shadow Tree, and there's an even cooler connection. There are some scattered red oak and maple leaves in the Shadow Tree chalice at the northernmost point of the Land of Shadow. And these leaves are, as far as I can tell, unique to only this location and one other, the Halig tree. And the tree, by being fertilized with Miquella's own body, his own blood, should reflect his nature, and it does. An eternal sapling, dual-trunked and destined to fail. Now, when I look at this image, I see Miquella gazing out onto his own fate. Trees watered with his blood form spirals, and trees which seem to reflect Miquella himself are also spirals. So to me it seems that we could look at the Halig tree as a sort of intermediate between Miquella's time as a Golden Order fundamentalist and the eventual truth which he would uncover during his ascension. From rigid and straight to spiralic. Indeed, much like how the Shadow Tree bears one straight trunk and one twisted. The nectar blood burgeon, which grows where the blood of Trina pooled, looks to have one wavy stalk winding around a straight one. I really think this is a good way of approaching Miquella's story, and, at least for me, yields more satisfying results that can remedy some of the gripes people had with how the story played out. So, the Shadow Tree, as described in the Shadow Sunflower Blossom description, has a second stalk which winds tightly around the first, almost as if it's in a tender embrace. It's very interesting then that the design of the shadow tree can be seen as two opposing halves in conflict, one suffocating and pulling the other down, just as well as it can be seen as two individuals in tender embrace, even facing each other as they fall away together. You can see how this imagery is strikingly evocative of Miquella's own nature. He and Trina trapped in a divine fate together, a central paradox. They love each other deeply, die as one, but are also irreconcilable opposites. The budding and the wilting as one. Lovers embracing while crumbling together, just as well as destroying one another. Love and loss, life and death, gold and shadow in a spiral. And if you needed any more ties between Miquella and the Shadow Tree, we have, of course, the Shadow Tree avatar, which bears Miquella's own shattered great rune, among a field of shattered fragments of the holy tree. I want to credit Bonfire VN for these visuals here, showing how the avatar even has some similar physical characteristics to Miquella. Namely, the forearms with one incomplete. Miquella's long-standing tie to flowers in place, and some very interesting ideas come to mind. The position of the avatar before the fight is also somewhat reminiscent of the wilted, drooping shape of Miquella's lily. In fact, most of the shadow sunflowers here have this unique and distinct posture, unlike the other ones we find in the Land of Shadow. And this is the place where Miquella discarded his great rune. We don't know for certain whether the Shadow Tree avatar precedes Miquella or is somehow incarnated by his great rune. But if we are to run with the parallel, what can we make of the fact that as the avatar grows stronger throughout his fight, it also grows weary? It slumps over, taking longer pauses between attacks. It seems tired, and its music slows. And again, it bears Miquella's great rune. So what does any of this have to do with Miquella? Well, I think that the nature of this fight is one of a few examples about how details about Miquella's story, which have been abandoned by him, are told in places other than his own lore, for the exact reason that they have been abandoned in these places. You'll hear me use the term inadvertent or indirect storytelling a lot when it comes to this kind of thing. So if we are to conclude that the avatar is meant to parallel Miquella's own situation, the implications of that are quite well in line with what I'll come to propose about Miquella's ascension and his fate anyways. That as Miquella abandoned parts of himself, he became less and grew weary. So then I do have to address one potential hole in these ideas. And it has to do with the fact that I'm making the claim that Miquella is succumbing to a predetermined fate during his ascension. In the description for Miquella's great rune, it is said that Miquella abandoned even his fate in an attempt to bury the original sin and be reborn as a new god. One of my main points is that at the end of Shadow of the Erdtree, Miquella succumbs to his fate by ascending to this divine prison and then dying. I do personally think that the fate this description is referring to is his fate with respect to Marika and the Golden Order and his inheritance of the Elden Ring, and not the affliction, which is what we're focused on here, and which I think is far more important than it would seem at first glance. The way this description is written, and the fact that it's for Miquella's great rune, a fragment of the Elden Ring, implies to me that it was through abandoning this rune that Miquella abandoned his fate. And this rune is a fragment of the Elden Ring and a symbol of Miquella's golden inheritance, which he certainly did abandon. And here is a good time to talk about another piece of the story that I think is critically important and often overlooked, relating to Miquella's sacrifice and how it explains the events of the DLC. Like I said before, we know that once he arrived in the Land of Shadow, Miquella began to discard aspects of himself, his flesh, his eye, his heart, his doubt and vacillation, his love, and even his fear. And I think that this abandon is the culminating expression of the decay aspect of MIQUELLA'S affliction of abundance and decay, and is also paralleled by the eternal crumbling of the dual golden-blooded shadow tree. So, by the time MIQUELLA had ascended to the final steps of the spiral tower where his fate would culminate, what was left? To answer that, I think a crucial part of MIQUELLA'S story comes from this idea: that to abandon everything to become a god is to be a god left with nothing. The shadow tree, which mirrors him, after all, is said to one day crumble from its core and scatter across the entire realm of shadow. MIQUELLA'S lily is just on the verge of wilting, and we can never reach that lone nascent butterfly. You might start to sense a pattern here. MIQUELLA was subject to abandon the parts of himself that were meant to define the godhood he had to abandon them for. Now, if I'm making any sense at all, I'm hoping the picture I'm trying to paint is starting to become clear. To me, there's a tragic, inevitable sense to everything that happened in MIQUELLA'S story. And with that said, I'm almost ready to talk about the ending of Shadow of the Erdtree, but I have a few more topics I want to set up first. So hopefully what I'm theorizing makes as much sense as possible. And that is Saint Trina. I considered giving Trina an entire video on her own, but I think what I'm proposing works well in this context. So, in a way which is essentially identical to Marika and Radagon's shared existence, MIQUELLA has another half, Saint Trina, who, again, much like MIQUELLA's parents, Marika and Radagon, shows some similar traits to their counterpart, but also many opposite ones. Like how both are male and female halves, and how while Marika embodies gold and grace and the Golden Order, Radagon embodies shadow and the chaos of the Crucible, namely through his giant's red hair and his tie to the Shadow Tree. But still, Radagon was a staunch Golden Order fundamentalist, and he was the half who attempted to mend the Elden Ring, while it was Marika who attempted to shatter it. It would seem this dual nature is a required aspect of the Hornsense divine invocation, that both Marika and MIQUELLA ascended by, especially after the DLC, with how the Hornsense jarring ritual involved the merging of different qualities. So when it comes to MIQUELLA and Trina, we see a similar relationship. Both compel an intoxicating affection and draw a devout, even religious following. And yet, while it is the warmth of MIQUELLA's abundant radiance that compels his followers, it is the embrace of Trina's gentle sleep which compels hers. It seems that though MIQUELLA was once called the slumbering demigod, that aspect has been abandoned with his beloved Trina. Even still, both are characterized by a sense of respite and salvation, and a unique rarity, something precious, like a flower. We again see the importance of that flower imagery. Every item associated with MIQUELLA or Trina is exceptionally rare to find, and often very inconspicuously hidden. MIQUELLA and Trina were one, but by the time we arrive in the Land of Shadow, MIQUELLA has abandoned even her to his divine ritual, an act that I think has been really misunderstood in a lot of the community dialogue surrounding it. It seems like a lot of people took this as evidence of just how cruel and relentless MIQUELLA was in his godly ambition, that he would cast Trina aside, who loved him more than anything. I read it completely differently, though. My first time through the Stone Coffin Fissure, I felt that distinct sense of loss and sadness, and I felt that it extended to MIQUELLA as well. The game specifically describes this event as MIQUELLA having been unable to save his other half, and I think this language is important. Tonally and thematically, it seems to me like MIQUELLA loved Trina just as much as she loved him, and that a more accurate way to describe her abandon is that they both lost each other to their shared affliction. An affliction, I will argue, is MIQUELLA's ascension. This point might make the most sense nearer to the end of this video, but what I'll say for now is that I think as Miquella lost more and more of himself to this divine affliction, the less control he had over it. So by the time Trina was cast into the fissure, it wouldn't have mattered if Miquella did or didn't want this to happen. It was simply an inevitable step in the development of their shared fate. They were irreconcilable opposites, and as we'll get into soon, the splitting of the two halves of this being, Miquella and Trina, was a fundamental part of this ascension. It's also important to talk about the way that Trina's essence, her nectar, which is again well in line with all the floral imagery, has changed since she has been abandoned. Prior to being cast away, Trina was depicted with paler, softer tones of purple, which were linked to a gentle sleep. The description of Trina's lily describes her pale purple essence as being capable of dulling the senses and preventing agitation, whereas once we reach her place of abandon in the land of shadow, this essence has darkened, deepened. What was once a pale purple inducing sedation and calm has now descended into a deep velvet purple, which delves its victims into the depths of eternal sleep. As Tialie says, sleep is a balm, and eternal sleep is an elixir. Trina's nectar has grown more toxic, and the line between sleep and death has been blurred since she has been abandoned in the Cerulean coast, a place so closely tied to death in the land of shadow, which itself is closely tied to death. It's easy to see how central nervous system depressants like heroin, morphine, and codeine are a useful parallel here. In smaller amounts, they offer relief and relaxation. But as their effect deepens, they not only can lure individuals towards them indefinitely, but often lower and lower towards death. Tialie again is a great example of this, in the way that he grows obsessed with Trina and her nectar, to the point that all he desires is to be submerged in the depths of its eternal sleep. With reference to this effect as it pertains to Miquella, you could say that Leda is another example of this, as she seems lost in her devotion to Miquella. In that sense, the imagery of Trina having been cast down into the depths is deeply poetic. But before he could bring himself to cast her into the fissure, he had to abandon his very doubt and his vacillation. I hadn't heard of the word vacillation before this, and so I found out that it means an inability to decide between two things. So I think the story is clear. Miquella had doubts. He had inner conflict, and couldn't bring himself to abandon the only other being that would ever truly understand his cruel fate. To me, there is no doubt that Miquella loved Trina, and this act of abandonment was likely far more emotionally nuanced and, frankly, interesting than much of the online community would lead you to believe. I imagine this enormous, impossible emotional struggle where Miquella and Trina both lost each other to their shared fate, and neither could do anything to prevent it. Miquella's vacillation, his inability to bring himself to abandon his love, is also reflective of the fissure itself. A fissure is a large crack or chasm in the land, but it's also a state of incompatibility, a difference between opposites. So the word fissure, to me, is meant to be evocative of both ideas. Another way that the fissure seems to strongly embody the relationship between halves is how the red of Caro's hidden grave and the blue of the Cerulean coast culminate in the misty purple of the fissure down below. Again, it's all very poetic, and I wonder about the timeline of all this, since Miquella's abandonment of Trina is a relatively recent event, and yet it seems to fit quite well thematically with the place where it occurred. It's very interesting, and honestly, the storytelling is so beautiful that I'm not too concerned with trying to figure out how it all makes sense timeline-wise. This is a tangent I'm not going to bother going down right now, but also considering the fact that the vibrant flowers of the coast seem entirely spared from Mesmer's crusade by fire, could imply that the area has only become the way that it is since Trina was abandoned. But that's a little too far off track. Anyways, after Miquella abandoned his doubt, he lost St. Trina, marked by a cross which tells us that by abandoning her, he abandoned his love. This can be taken in two ways, and I think, honestly, it's probably meant to have a double meaning. One is that Miquella has lost the emotion of love embodied by Trina, and another is that Trina was his love in the way that you would call a loved one, my love. This is another big reason why I think the game is really trying to imply that this was not an act of selfish disregard and ambition, but was a loss on both sides, and an inevitable one. Miquella's doubt was irreconcilable with his godhood, and there's an even deeper layer as to why Miquella had to abandon Trina that I'll get to in a moment. Before that, I want to take a look at Trina's dialogue. A lot of spoken dialogue in Souls games is sort of meant to have one surface-level interpretation while also subtly hinting at larger-scale aspects of the story, and I think this is no exception. Miquella abandoned his doubt, and then Trina seems to embody that doubt, since she expresses how godhood would be a prison, and describes Miquella's ascension as something that must be avoided, something to spare him from. She asks that we kill him, and in doing so, we would offer him forgiveness. As she says, a caged divinity is beyond saving. At the cross where Miquella abandoned his doubt, it was the blood of St. Trina which pooled, and not his own. To me, this again implies that Trina bears, in some way, Miquella's doubt. So here is what I think is the crucial undertone of Trina's role in this whole story, and another essential aspect of why Miquella's story ended the way that it did. The words of Trina are doubts Miquella once held. If they weren't, he wouldn't have had anything to abandon. I think Miquella's doubt is both his doubt towards his act of abandoning Trina and his doubt about his godhood overall. They are things he can no longer say, for he has sacrificed them with St. Trina. After all, the two are one and the same. In a strange and beautiful way, I think these are sort of Miquella's words. This is him asking us for forgiveness and to prevent his own ascension. This doubt is a vestige of a part of Miquella now lost. These are things he can no longer say, and that is only for abandoned Trina, who now lays in a deep sleep, cradled by a wilting flower, likely fertilized by the putrescent flesh that dripped down to the bottom of the fissure, as if it was compelled by her intoxicating nectar. This flesh is impure and long unrested, having not been burned by ghost flame, so the draw of Trina's deep, velvet sleep as it comes closer to becoming death itself is likely irresistible. Trina bears the doubts which would have guided Miquella away from his ascension to this divine prison, doubts which are now deep down, sealed inside of the slumber of a forgotten love, at the bottom of an ocean of death, at the southernmost and remote part of a forgotten land sealed in shadow. They are so hidden. This is very reminiscent of psychoanalytic notions of the subconscious, and how parts of ourselves can be submerged so deep down that we lose conscious awareness of their existence. Elden Ring, of course, takes this very literally, as these thoughts are submerged below the ocean, which, by the way, has also been long tied to death in the game. Interestingly, the psychoanalysis of Carl Jung is closely tied to alchemy, which will come to be an essential inspiration for these exact events. St. Trina and the Shadow Tree Avatar are two instances, in this theory, of details about Miquella's story being told in lore separate to his own, exactly for the reason that those details have been abandoned in these places. When you consider this, of course Miquella himself would not display any of these properties of his weary, collapsing self or his suffocating doubt. These are things that are no longer a part of him, but instead are scattered in faraway places, such as with the absolute southernmost and northernmost points in the Land of Shadow. If you ask me, his story being told in this inadvertent, indirect way is brilliant and poetic. Take it as a sort of I have no mouth and I must scream scenario, and MIQUELLA'S story takes on a tragic new quality, especially when you consider the idea that MIQUELLA'S inevitable fate was for this to happen, and that he knew it. So before we finally get to the end of MIQUELLA'S story, there is one last aspect of St. Trina that I want to cover, and that's in its inspirations. It appears that abandoning Trina was a required step in MIQUELLA'S ascension, but why? After all, we have no evidence of Marika ever having abandoned her other half, Radagon. The two still share a body by the time we reach them, an age after Marika ascended. This is a tangent, but I'll note that it does seem like recently the community has developed an understanding of a certain illegitimacy to Marika's godhood, which could be related to exactly that. But coming back to the question of why Trina's abandon seems to have been essential, our best line of inquiry is with alchemy, and in particular, the rebus or the magnum opus. If you aren't familiar with this concept, it's a very overt inspiration for Marika and Radagon and their godhood. The rebus is essentially the ultimate goal of all alchemy, a non-dual male and female hermaphrodite, in which two opposite forces are as one again. It can be thought of as a reconciliation of opposites, and as such is deeply divine. It is frequently depicted as the Red King and the White Queen, and is also associated with the sun and moon, as well as matter and spirit, so the inspiration is obvious. But it applies very well to MIQUELLA and Trina too, which does make sense considering both gods ascended via the same horn-scent ritual and do have similar dual natures. So then, it's very interesting that the two main steps involved in the creation of a rebus in alchemy, or a god in the lands between, are putrefaction and purification of the respective halves, so that they can be reconjoined in a divine ascension. St. Trina is closely linked to the idea of putrescence in the Land of Shadow. She is located in the stone coffin fissure, which features putrescent flesh dripping down from the stone coffins down below to where she is, and her own night which protects her is the putrescent night. The decaying putrescence which fell down is likely what fertilized the flower which now cradles Trina as she grows closer and closer to death. The implication here is that if part of why Trina was abandoned was so that one of the halves of MIQUELLA could be left to putrefy, then the other half, MIQUELLA himself, must have been purified. Is there a case for this, aside from MIQUELLA having been long referred to as pure? Yes, there is. The story now turns to the penultimate boss of the DLC. Not Letta and her allies, that doesn't count. I'm talking about Romina. What does Romina have to do with any of this? For the longest time, I tried to figure out the way she fit into the larger story of Shadow of the Erdtree and was stumped, since she feels a little out of place for a late-game boss. We know that during Mesmer's cleansing by fire against the Hornscent, that Romina knelt in the Church of the Bud as it burned, holding the bud in speechless silence. That bud would become her blade, the pole blade of the bud, whose unique skill is Romina's purification, which was once considered a sacred act of purification. It's also worth noting that in some translations, the name Romina means purity. So, suspecting MIQUELLA was purified before he could ascend, given that St. Trina was undoubtedly putrefied, and this is all very strongly inspired by alchemy, it is interesting that the last boss we encounter before entering the place where MIQUELLA ascends is Romina, who once used the Scarlet Bud to purify. After all, there is a cross of MIQUELLA in Rao, and so we know he passed through here and almost certainly encountered Romina. And it is Romina who guards the Sealing Tree, which is clearly connected to the Shadow Tree in both its visual design and in relation to Shadow, and as we showed before, MIQUELLA is connected to the Shadow Tree. So, do you remember earlier when I mentioned that I think the Land of Shadow revealed in a lot clearer detail that rebirth half of the Scarlet Rot, as opposed to the Decay half we saw in the base game? Well, if the idea of Romina purifying Miquella before he could become a god has any credence, then this would fit very well. In order to be reborn as a god, Miquella had to be purified by the Scarlet Bud. There's further ties between Miquella and the Scarlet Bud in that it is a bud, but also that its description is again reminiscent of Miquella, as it is described as a bud that will never come into bloom. You can see how the budding and wilting imagery is here as well. And back on the topic of how Miquella and Malenia share an inseparable fate, which was to be reborn by and succumb to their afflictions via a divine ascension. Both of these divine ascensions could have taken place with help from the Scarlet Rot, if this is true. And this is all really well in line with very fundamental things that we know about the Scarlet Rot, which is that it is a cycle of decay and rebirth. So why is it that the Scarlet manifests differently here in the Land of Shadow? I think there's a couple reasons. There's a strong theme in the DLC of motherhood and the difference between motherhood which has been abandoned and motherhood which has been held on to. And there's an aspect of Romina's story, which is her essentially becoming a mother figure for this infantile Scarlet Bud, holding it and cradling it. And then after that happens, there's an element of purity and rebirth through the rot, whereas Malenia, for example, spent her entire life fighting it off and rejecting it. And so within her, it manifested as decay. I also think another reason for this could come back to the fact that the Land of Shadow is closer in proximity to the power of the Crucible, and it's very likely that the Scarlet Rot is a sort of aspect of the Crucible. So it seems to me like Miquella's last step before passing through the Shadow to access Anir Lim was to be ritually purified by Romina and her Scarlet Bud, the final step, so that he could then be reborn as a new whole. Or at least, so it seems. It's poetic that this is the same divine essence which ravaged his Halig tree and his twin sister Malenia, but this time, it was manifest as a bud, much like him, and much like the ascension that would follow. It's here that we finally have the pieces to reach the end. The spiral tower reaching to the heavens themselves, where a wounded and fearful god-to-be, or what was left of him, climbed the final steps to the fate that he would both be reborn by and succumb to. This is the last section and probably the most important. We've arrived at the gate of divinity. When we finally reach Miquella atop Anir Lim, his ascension has just been completed. It is as nascent as it possibly could be. Miquella was reborn into this godhood, but we didn't see what happened in the moments prior. But this last gravestone was just at the gates of his fate, his fear. Through all of Miquella's journey, until these last steps, Miquella had fear. After all, in his memory cutscene at the very end, he doesn't really sound like he wants this. He sounds afraid of what's to come, like powerless. He looks to Radahn for comfort, someone to accompany him in what is seeming more and more to be a terrible divine fate that he had no more say in than anyone else did. And in a bit, we'll be able to tie all of this into why the vow with Radahn is so important. I think my conclusion to all of this, at least for me, satisfyingly explains why the Miquella that we get feels so different from the Miquella we thought we would, and why the vow is suddenly the most important aspect of his entire plan, where previously we had never even heard of it. But to come back to the topic of Miquella's fear and his abandon in general, I think it's important to recognize that we only see Miquella immediately after he has been successfully reborn. And what we see doesn't match the description of what you would expect based on what you have heard he has abandoned. Ansbach tells us that this abandon is undoubtedly painful. And it's sort of like a self-mutilation, is the impression that you get leading up to Miquella. But then when you find him, other than his shut eyes and one fading arm, he looks all right. And I think the reason for this is exactly what we've been talking about. He has been reborn and successfully purified. And so all of the ways that he wounded himself leading up to this point are now sort of invisible. When I imagine him climbing these final steps, what I see is harrowing. A mortally wounded, entirely empty, and entirely alone God. Miquella was subject to abandon the parts of himself that were meant to define the godhood he had to abandon them for. It's quite well with all the ways we already knew Miquella held a sort of divine paradox within him. And we can see how this divine paradox has extended to the nature of his ascension. And with all of himself sacrificed, he is stripped clean, purified, and born anew. And with that, he heralds the return of his consort's lost soul. And together the two intend to usher in their age of compassion, if even for just a fleeting moment. This is the first and last time we ourselves get to see Miquella. His body is gone, and he looks to be a golden spirit. Eyes have long been an important part of the lore of Elden Ring, with Melina and Ranni's single shut eyes, Mesmer's seal over his eye, Hyetta, Mohg, the Thorn Sorcerers, Melania. All of these seem to tell a story about how, when the light of this world, possibly the light of the Erd Tree, cannot be seen, that one can feel the guidance of some other faint, distant, divine light. For Hyetta, it was the yellow glow of the frenzied flame. For Mohg, it was the formless mother. YouTuber Silent Ellipses came up with a lot of these ideas and has this amazing video on this topic, which is part of his grand unified theory of Elden Ring. So, what does Miquella see behind his two shut eyes? Well, it could involve his role as the slumbering demigod. It could involve how in Eastern religions, which the DLC is heavily inspired by, shut eyes are tied to deep, meditative, spiritual states. It could simply be that with all of himself, including his eye abandoned, Miquella can simply no longer see, and there is nothing left within him to guide him anywhere. I would imagine a godhood like this is dark, empty, and quiet, exactly like the memory cutscene. I think it's a godhood he is lost to. You can see why I've emphasized the paradox of how Miquella was both reborn by and succumbed to this affliction in the same instant, the same act of becoming a god. Now, Miquella and Melania's inseparable fate makes even more sense, since the exact same thing happened to her. By being reborn as the goddess of rot, she became its true vessel, but in the same instant, succumbed to her affliction and lost herself. Miquella is no different. If you were anything like me, you felt a little confused reaching the top of a near limb. Like something about Miquella and Radahn was uncanny. His only dialogue here is referring to Radahn, his return, and the vow. It was sort of like the Miquella we met didn't feel quite how we expected he would, and I think this is a deliberate choice on the developer's part. I think we are meant to wonder why it is that Miquella seems so focused on this vow with Radahn, compared to everything else we've known about him up until this point. And I think the answer is directly related to the idea I brought up earlier, that to sacrifice everything to become a god is to be a god left with nothing. I think the vow with Radahn is quite literally all that remains of Miquella. The rest has been abandoned, crumbled, fragmented away. To introduce that idea, let me ask you, why does Miquella die when Radahn dies? He, now just a spirit who looks as if he's fading away, quite literally clings to Radahn. You can definitely call this speculative, but I really feel like this is a lot more of a satisfying and complete and compelling way to understand the story being told here, at least for me. Shadow of the Erdtree ends when we touch a faint, shimmering ray of one of Miquella's memories left behind after their death. Maybe the only thing left guiding Miquella through this empty, isolated, divine prison which he was never going to escape is a memory. The memory of a vow made in their youth, long before Miquella ever knew of the darker, more sacrificial nature of what would inevitably come to pass. Back in a time when an idealized, hopeful age of compassion, budding with radiance and potential, was all he knew. I think it's more accurate to imagine that this Miquella, here at the Gate of Divinity, is more of a ghost than anything. This is simply whatever is left after the rest has been lost, and all that is left is a vow. The reason that the only thing Miquella speaks of is the vow is because it is the only thing left guiding him through this empty, divine prison. The ghost of a god clinging to the memory of a vow. The one thing left tethering him to anything at all. And when even that is lost, Miquella simply fades away with it. He and Radahn have become one, and like a flower, wilt away as one. You can also see how this union is evocative of the dual nature of everything in Elden Ring. Miquella says to Radahn, "At long last, you are returned." But Radahn has not been dead long at all. In the grand scheme of things, we just killed him. So considering that the form Radahn takes in this fight is that of how he was in Miquella's youth and at the time of the vow, I think it's safe to say that Miquella was yearning for that old, long-lost version of his elder brother. The final encounter, the grand conclusion of Elden Ring, is just a memory held close until the very end. I've got a Bloodborne spoiler ahead. FromSoft has done this before, with the Orphan of Kos. We defeat the poor, wizened child, but then, after the fact, we learn that what we fought was merely a projection. The true orphan was this small, barely noticeable black phantom, close to its mother's washed-up body. I think this memory after Miquella's death is so important, and it's so sad. And in saying this, I'm not saying that the Radahn that we fight isn't actually real. I'm treating all this very poetically, and I think you should too. When we first awoke in the Lands Between, we already had the Memory of Grace item in our inventory. The memory of first grace, the first light, seen not just by our Tarnished, but by all of them. This shared memory. Memories may have been part of the story from the very start, and this one does bear a passing resemblance to that very memory of first grace. To me, this interpretation totally recontextualizes the ending of Shadow of the Erdtree. The grandeur, the spectacle of this fight. The sense of the heralding of a new god and his lord, but all just for a fleeting moment before fading away. Based on everything we've theorized about Miquella in this video, what truer fate is there for him to have? Many players felt dissatisfied that after everything, Shadow of the Erdtree just ends. No secret option to side with Miquella, nothing. There is no option other than for Miquella to die, and for the Age of Compassion to be lost at the very instant of its birth. And we could even look to that as evidence that all of this was inevitable, and in fact, I think that perspective is more in line thematically with what we've been shown about this whole story. Pretty much every aspect of Miquella's story is just on the precipice of becoming something greater, and then falling away. So, of course, the Age of Compassion, ripe with potential, was fated only to be a bud, which would never blossom. There, again, is that central divine paradox. There, again, is the butterfly just out of reach. You could reduce it to gameplay, or you could say it's very interesting that despite never engaging us directly, Miquella dies with Radahn, and that the two share a remembrance. As if the last thing literally keeping him anything at all was the vow, and that this is why the vow is all of a sudden of such importance, that it's even the only thing we ever hear Miquella speak of. It's all he can speak of. It is all that is left of him. There's that line of his, "Let us go together," which feels important to me. There's the obvious interpretation of the line, simply inviting others to join him in his age of compassion, but I'll speculate here and say that there is another meaning. Not just let us go together into the age of compassion, but let us go together. Let go of us. Our mission is, after all, to kill Miquella, and in doing so grant him forgiveness. And this request was made, in a way, by Miquella's own self. This would be well in line with the theme that I've claimed is so essential to Miquella's story of him being perpetually on the precipice, perpetually reaching out to touch before falling away. Maybe it's here at the gate of divinity, at what is far more of an end than any new beginning, where through us, Miquella can finally let go. We can summon Ansbach for this fight, and if you wanted, I think you could find a certain poetic parallel between the two. Ansbach is here because he has failed in his vow towards Mohg, and attempts to right those wrongs by defeating Radahn. According to his attire description, Ansbach understood that keeping his oath to his old master was not an act of logic, nor would it bear any justice. But it was for these very reasons that he was unable to let go. After the shared death of Radahn and Miquella, in the place where they came to be born anew, silence falls. The godly spectacle of their return is starkly contrasted by stillness, quiet. As far as I can find, unlike everywhere else in Elden Ring, there is no music at the Gate of Divinity, even if you come back here later. It's just quiet, and all that is left in their wake is a single, barely noticeable memory twinkling in the ash. The memory of a vow, made in childhood, a heartfelt plea made by a seemingly fearful yet hopeful demigod. This memory is empty aside from Miquella himself. Much like his godhood, it is dark and faint, and his words echo in the distance.
Lord brother, I'm going to be a god. If we honor our part of the vow, promise me you'll be my consort.
This memory, which we learn at the very end of it all, guided Miquella his whole life, is remembered one last time by us, and then never again. It fades along with everything else. There is a faint twinkling sound through this cutscene, and at the end, we can hear that twinkling shatter. Upon recalling this memory, we receive Miquella's circlet of light, whose description is a special one, as it's one of the last in the whole game. A circlet of light which adorned Miquella's head as he returned in divine aspect. It has begun to fade into nothingness. This circle was to be the very foundation upon which Miquella's age of compassion would be built, should it have ever come to pass. Way back in the gravesite plane, we can find an item called the Spirit Gravestone, whose description reads, "A piece of gravestone that has started to turn into a spirit. In places where the dead have been brought since antiquity, the oldest gravestones turn into spirits and then fade away. The dead arrive in the land of shadow, where they turn into spirits and then fade away. If you ask me, this is exactly what happened to Miquella." In connection to the spirit graves, we can also look to the fact that when night falls in the land of shadow, some circles of spirit graves will glow a ghostly hue and, from their center, produce a larval tear. There's more about these larval tears and about spirit graves that makes them very compelling that I'll save for a later date, but what is relevant right now is that their description and design contains themes, again, strongly tied to Miquella. Infancy, rebirth, a spirit body, a rarity, and a fleeting existence. If you come to the ending of Shadow of the Erdtree from the perspective of loss, it all becomes much more impactful. Something ripe with true potential, true compassion, and true change, wilting away just as it comes into existence. In this silence, Miquella is gone. Radahn is gone. Marika is gone. The Hornsent are gone. The shamans are gone. It's just quiet. And Miquella has been laid to rest, freed from this divine affliction in death, and his fate fulfilled. This tragic, inevitable journey is complete. The description of Erdtree Heal says that the Erdtree once flourished with abundance, yet it was only for a fleeting moment. Such is the course of all life. And while this is not in reference to Miquella, his own fate resembles this notion pretty perfectly. I've claimed a lot of times throughout this video that what happened with Miquella was inevitable, and that all of this was always fated to happen. He was always, from the very start, going to die at the gate of divinity upon becoming a god, and that this was his affliction. At first, I believed this as more of a personal headcanon, drawn from how a theme of being just on the precipice defined every aspect of Miquella's story. His ending is no different, and so I personally believed that all of this was simply inevitable from a thematic perspective. But I thought in order to ever claim that this was more than just a personal headcanon, I would need more. On my last lore playthrough leading up to this video, I made it back to the Halig Tree, the eternal sapling, much like Miquella himself, where, also much like himself, his knights gaze out onto the waters in futile perpetuity, hoping for a sign of his return that will never come. It's here that I found the Miquellan Knight's sword, and something in its description caught my attention. Sword forged by the servants of Miquella of the Halig Tree, with a design modeled after those carried by the Carrion Knights. Instead of glintstone, however, amber from the Halig Tree is embedded in the blade. A sumptuous piece, yet it has never been offered to any knight. An ill-starred sword with no master. I know this is one description, but bear with me. That phrase, ill-starred, was interesting. I had never heard it before, and so I looked it up, and ill-starred means destined to fail, fated for misfortune. So, a sword embedded with the amber of the failed Halig Tree, which is effectively just Miquella's own blood, becomes ill-starred. A sword which will never have a master, imbued with the essence of a sapling which will never grow, occupied by knights who long for a god who will never return, and that god who will never truly ascend, and his age of compassion, which will never come into existence. At that moment, at least for me, I felt I had found my proof. I believed that this ghost of Miquella, shorn of himself, was always going to be the one to reach the gate of divinity, and was always going to die there. Reborn by, succumbed to, and freed from, all in one moment. To me, this suggests that Miquella himself was always ill-starred. His story was, after all, so closely tied to fate and the stars, through amber starlight found at the base of a statue of Miquella and Melania, to his relationship to Radon, who held back the stars and whose death was essential for the unfolding of all of this, and also Miquella's own shedding of his golden fate as a child of the Earth Tree. Upon Radon's death, a falling star of fate fell, and the path it opened up led to the place where Miquella entered the Land of Shadow. Fate is a crucial part of this story. So then we can ask, was it Radon's fate to become Miquella's consort? Well, that question is a massive one which deserves its own deep dive, so keep an eye out. If we look back at that single nation butterfly, all the way back at the beginning of the game, as though it were subtly beckoning to us, as if it were saying, "Look at me. Aren't I curious?" Could we read this as evidence of Miquella subtly guiding us along a path which ended here at the Gate of Divinity? If you choose to count cut dialogue as evidence, then we know from Mesmer's cut lines that Miquella spoke of us. Then there's the fact that it appears Miquella ensured we receive Torrent at the beginning of our journey. The whistle with which we summon Torrent looks to be Miquella's craftsmanship, and he is depicted on Torrent's back in the DLC announcement image. There's also some more obtuse inquiries, one being that the first character we meet is Vare, a follower of Moog, who was under Miquella's influence. Another is that just up the path from that spot, we can encounter Rani at the Church of Ella. And there, she focuses quite closely on the fact that we have inherited Torrent, and says that the spirit calling bell she offers us was entrusted by Torrent's former master, further emphasizing that Miquella deliberately enabled us on our journey. The spirit calling bell itself is, after all, very reminiscent of the themes of the end of Shadow of the Earth Tree. Miquella called forth the spirit of a warrior which obeyed his command, but briefly, as it recalled battles long past. It does seem likely that in some capacity, Miquella led us here. But why? Again, consider that I think it's likely that along his journey, Miquella came to know what his curse, or his affliction, would entail. That his sacrifices made to mend the wounds of the past would consume him completely. I think he knew this would happen, and I think it is part of why he wants us here. Why would he deliberately ensure that we arrive here at the exact moment of his ascension, only to end it just as it began? Well, my personal conclusion is this: to free him. To offer him that forgiveness that the forgotten depths of his doubts begged of us. Miquella knew he would succumb to this fate. He knew he would be stripped of everything. He knew that when he ascended, he would need saving. If all of this is a kind of prophecy, which we touched on a bit and we'll cover more in the next video, then we fulfill the prophecy by killing Miquella, and in doing so, spare him from the empty divine prison which he has succumbed to. It's tragic, but also beautiful. We heard these exact words from Trina, so in a way, we heard these exact words from him. Miquella's life was one of following after an unreachable light, and his godhood was one where he was lost, and he could not see the way out. Maybe there's some poetry in the fact that in the consecrated snowfield, the place so strongly tied to Miquella as the path to his Halig tree, we find ourselves lost, wandering where we cannot see, guided by the faint lights of hope. The final light is here in Ordina, by the remains of a poor soul who no doubt made the pilgrimage to the Halig tree, only to collapse just on the precipice, just out of reach. Here at the end, I want to summarize what I consider to be the most important ideas in making sense of Miquella, and the events that unfolded in his story. MIQUELLA'S nature, his affliction, is a sort of divine paradox, a simultaneous abundance and decay, or budding and wilting. Hence why floral and plant imagery is often used for MIQUELLA, Trina, and Malenia. It's as though the duality within him is like the duality between the transitory seasons: spring, the budding, and autumn, the wilting. MIQUELLA'S affliction was not eternal youth. That was a symptom of something more. The affliction of abundance and decay. This is the inseparable fate that he shares with his twin sister. The decay aspect manifested in MIQUELLA most strongly when he arrived in the Land of Shadow, where he, a dual, golden-blooded demigod, crumbled, fragmented, or decayed, and scattered across the land. Just like the dual, golden-sapped, and eternally crumbling shadow tree. Hence why there are shadow tree fragments at the sites where MIQUELLA fragmented. The Halig tree reflects the shadow tree in many ways too. With respect to Trina, we're meant to take her expressing doubt about MIQUELLA'S godhood as doubts he once held, but can no longer express, since he has abandoned them with her. These are MIQUELLA'S doubts, and as such, in a way, Trina's dialogue is MIQUELLA asking us to spare him. The scarlet rot, which took hold of Malenia, is a cycle of decay and rebirth. Malenia succumbed to her affliction in the same moment she was reborn by it, and MIQUELLA is no different. His affliction is his ascension. He was fated from the start to ascend to this empty, divine prison, and, in doing so, crumble away, leaving nothing left by the time he reached the gate of divinity. This paradox is written into MIQUELLA'S fate, and this is why, for his whole life, every aspect of his story was a bud which would never blossom, something writ with almost. As such, fundamental to MIQUELLA'S age of compassion is that it was never going to come into existence. It was always going to end at the exact moment of its birth, and MIQUELLA was always going to be shorn of himself in the Land of Shadow, and then die at the gate of divinity. To abandon everything to become a god is to be a god left with nothing. This is why the only thing we ever hear MIQUELLA speak of is the vow with Radahn, and why it is suddenly the most important aspect of MIQUELLA'S story. With everything else lost, the vow with Radahn is quite literally the only thing left of MIQUELLA. This is why, despite never engaging us directly, MIQUELLA dies with Radahn. The vow is the last thing keeping him anything at all. This is why it is suddenly of such importance. MIQUELLA was subject to abandon the parts of himself that were meant to define the godhood he had to abandon them for. He had to come to the Land of Shadow not just because it was where the Gate of Divinity was, but because this place and its holy tree beckoned him toward a fate he had from the very start. It was always going to end here. This divine paradox meant that for his entire life, MIQUELLA was in a state of being perpetually just on the precipice, the beginning and the end. Precious and profound, yet fragile and ill-starred. Forever reaching out and almost touching, but never quite. And that is why my favorite piece of environmental storytelling in all of Elden Ring is these little precious nation butterflies at the very start of the game, just out of reach, before falling away. Just like how, even after defeating Radahn and MIQUELLA, we can never actually ascend the steps of the Gate of Divinity and see what lies beyond. Just out of reach. In the moment of MIQUELLA's death, his love and other half, Saint Trina, is also released from the same fate. When I finish the DLC, I always make sure to come back to Trina and collect the blossom which, finally, after a lifetime of budding and wilting, blooms upon their death. In the soundtrack for the game, which is for the most part listed in order of progression, St. Trina's theme is placed very last, even after Radahn's. So with that, I consider this to be the last piece of written lore for Elden Ring. St. Trina's life withered and fell, as fleeting as the seasons. At her last, she left a single water lily. Despite the velvety purple hue, the flower is in no way poisonous. It merely blooms in quietude. In that same vein of inadvertent storytelling we've hopefully come to appreciate, I think those lines are meant to represent Miquella just as well as Trina. Her nectar came closer and closer to death as Miquella came closer and closer to rebirth, and upon their inevitable death, that nectar is at last freed from its toxicity. It is in no way poisonous. It merely blooms in quietude. It's pure poetry, and I can't think of a better ending for the story of Miquella than that. If you left Shadow of the Erdtree with a feeling that something never quite came to fruition in the way you thought it should have, then I think you're exactly on the right track. If you felt like the Miquella you met was empty of the Miquella you thought you would, you're exactly on the right track. And if you left wishing that there was something more, that something felt so close and then was gone, then you are exactly on the right track. If you made it to the end, thank you. The subject has been a little passion project of mine for the last little while. I've never tried to make a video before, and I just felt like this was a perspective that wasn't getting talked about that could maybe make this ending more enjoyable for the people who felt underwhelmed. This is my favorite story in all of Elden Ring, enough so that I have 2 more episodes coming out as soon as possible, focusing on all the things I could find that help make the ending of Shadow of the Erdtree, the reveal of Radahn and Miquella's union, make sense as a conclusion to the story. Those will be more traditional lore hunting videos and less like the character analysis that this was, but I think you might learn some things in them that could really captivate you. They definitely captivated me. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.